Hello and welcome everyone to this special interview on Baha'i Blog. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this today, the Ugambi language people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. Today's episode is a special episode in honor of NAIDOC Week. NAIDOC Week is a special celebration which happens in the month of July every year across Australia, where we celebrate the history and culture of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the First Nations people of this land. Joining me today is our special guest, Marjorie Reid. Marjorie, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited about this conversation.
You're very welcome.
Marjorie, just to start off, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your peoples and where you're from in Australia?
My people are the Wulli Wulli people. We come from the country in Queensland that is in the Auburn and Hawkwood district, and our tribe is called the Wulli Wulli. Our totem is the owl, and I was raised on my country right up until I was a teenager.
And what was that experience like?
Very different for someone of my age, living in this ever-advancing world that we live in. So I was raised in the bush. My father was European and my mother Aboriginal. And we were raised with our grandmother, grandfather, and uncles and aunts, extended family. It was at a time when I believe my father removed us from town so as we weren't going to be stolen like many other Indigenous children, especially because of the mixed blood.
Tell us a little bit about this concept of, or not this concept, this sad historical fact that happened of the stolen generation, for those who are joining us and who don't know about this.
It was the police were the protectorates at the time of my birth, and in fact at the time of the birth of my eldest son, who would have been 46 this year. And the police would come and check on the families to see if they were doing the right thing by their children and staying out of mischief, living across Boundary Street. Just about every town in Australia, I think, has a Boundary Street or Boundary Creek Road. And this was because Europeans had set up the townships and the Indigenous peoples weren't allowed in that area.
So this boundary was actually like a boundary, like you couldn't cross the boundary.
You couldn't cross it, no.
Wow.
Yeah. So insofar as what we talk about, the stolen generation, is when children were taken away from their parents to be raised in foster homes, usually by one of the churches. And they had no connection to their communities. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They became slaves basically as children. They were sent to work for mainly property owners on the sheep or cattle stations. And in fact, at Auburn Station, in the logbooks for the cattle, the people were recorded as in their livestock books.
Wow. And this is recent history, correct?
Oh, this is very recent history, yes.
Wow.
Yes.
So for those listening, what do you think are some things? I mean, for someone who doesn't know anything about Indigenous culture in Australia, what are some of the things that, I know we can't generalize, and I know there's many varied, even just that fact that there's so many different language groups here. I think, Marjorie, I want to hear just like if you can share some general things like that, that people would, I think there's this misconception that the Aboriginals, and it's just this one homogenous type of people, but could you share a little bit about some of the things that people might not know about the Indigenous peoples of Australia?
I can speak to my family members whom I grew up around. My great uncle Ned, who was a coach boy from the age of about 9 or 10 for Cobb and Co, and living out on our traditional country and observing their behaviours. The men would speak in our Wulli Wulli language, but the women didn't. And it was in about 1988, the last surviving member of my family passed away, and he was the last person to speak our language. So the language, the Wulli Wulli language, was taken away. We learned all of the naughty words, and a few words like binang. Binang gwinj means deaf. Bingar, hat, booginj, dog, all of these little words. But that was because they used those in daily conversation.
Right.
So the spiritual connection I observed my mother to have is one that she has passed on to all of her children. And there were 7 of us. And being connected to the land in which we came from, where we hunted, fished, where we set up camp, the food that we ate, the bush tucker that we ate. While I don't know the names, even in Aboriginal language, I know those plants today and can go walking through the bush and know what I can eat and what I can't eat.
Huh.
But
what can you tell me? How did your parents meet, actually? Is that an interesting story?
Oh, it's a beautiful love story.
I'd love to hear it.
So my dad was in the Air Force in World War II, and his parents passed away, and he was left in the care of his brother, who lived in Brisbane, had a beautiful big mansion of a homestead on the riverbank of the Brisbane River. And so when he came back from Papua New Guinea, he came to Brisbane and he wanted to become a mechanic. And my father was very academic, and his brother said no. So he packed his swag and threw it over his back and took off up country and went to Gayndah. When he arrived in Gayndah, he went to work for a property owner called Mrs. Payne, Hilda Payne. And my mother was a house girl for Hilda Payne. And he saw my mother, he fell in love with her, threw her into a trough and asked her to marry him.
Wow. So just for people who don't know what a house girl is, what is that?
House girl. They do all the housework for the property owner. Yeah. Like a maid servant.
Right.
Yeah.
And what year was that? What year was it that they got married? Do you know?
Oh, it was in the 30s. I can't recall.
Yeah. Was it controversial at all? Was it, something?
Well, my father was quite ostracized by the white community.
Right.
He always wanted to march at, Anzac Day, and he wasn't really accepted by the white community.
Wow.
And in fact, he's got several grandchildren, and until he passed away in 1998, they didn't even know that he was not Indigenous.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when my sisters were about 10 and 11 years old, my older sisters, I have one younger sister, they were all sent away also to work for property owners as house girls as well. So that was in the 60s.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
So one of my friends, I was talking to them about the Indigenous people of Australia, and they're saying that it's funny because in Australia there's two things. One, Indigenous history, culture is not really studied in schools today. Like they do like a little bit of a paragraph here and there. And two, it's kind of treated as this kind of past thing of Australia, as if it's like something that happened in the old, like ancient days. There were the Indigenous people, but it's a living, breathing, thing that continues today. Can you talk on that a little bit?
It certainly is more prevalent today, I feel, because people want to reconnect. They realize that the trauma that's happened, that has been done to them. And so, even though families are dispersed and, living apart, we have technology and so stay connected, and visiting country is something that most every Aboriginal person that I know and family member that I have want to and make efforts to go home to country.
And what does that mean, actually? What does it mean to go home to country?
That is the connection to that land of our ancestors, and, seeing the skies, the trees, and being able to recognize those spots that we grew up with, and just that close connected family.
Do you know much about the traditions and the religion of your people? Was that something that was taught to you growing up?
No, just through observations. What we took to eat when we hunted was what we needed. I'll tell you a little yarn.
Yeah, tell me.
So I was a terrible tomboy, and I have a brother who is 2 years older than me, and I'm a rabbito. So rabbitohs used to come onto the properties to, help wipe out poison, or trap. At that time it was actually. They didn't use the poison at that time. They used traps. So he showed my brother and I how to make traps to catch rabbits. Well, we caught kangaroos, possums, and we were going out hunting with Mum one day, and we were walking down a fence line, and there was a couple of kangaroos, a couple of possums, and we got a big flogging, because you don't kill things for the sake of killing them or hunting them. There was a need for taking that life of the animal, and it was to eat, which we did, which we had to do.
Yeah. Wow, interesting. So can you tell me a little bit about your journey to becoming a Baha'i?
That's a beautiful story. So one of the things that I've been very blessed to have the capacity to be a dreamer, and things were revealed to me in dreams. And so I would get out of bed in the morning, or first thing, and I'd draw a picture of what I had dreamt about, if I felt it was of significance. And so in about 1989, I had a dream of this door. And I don't know, I'd never, who dreams about a door? And on either side of the door were some Indigenous paintings. So I drew a picture, I put it on the fridge, and then about 2 years later, we arrived in Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. And I became friends with a lady who was a Baha'i, Anita Parkinson. And she invited me to come to the Baha'i Center. And so I told her that I would come. So I, washed up the kids. We packed in the car and took them down to the Baha'i Center. And as I walked up the stairs into the Baha'i Center, there was the picture, and I'm going to cry.
Yeah, I am too.
Of the door. And on either side of that door were the Indigenous paintings.
Wow.
So it was just so amazing.
Wow.
And that was, and then, just reading the prayers and reading the writings of Baha'u'llah was something that just was so spiritual. And I embraced the Baha'i faith.
Wow, that's amazing. Was it?
That was 1991.
Wow. Were you religious at all before that? Like, were you practicing?
I had attended different churches, and I was kicked out of a few of them too. And that was because, they're saying things like, that all Indigenous peoples, weren't created by God. That was basically what they were saying. And I was thinking, wow, how can you say this when the Bible says,
Yeah, wow.
we're all created by God? So where did I come from? Where did all my people come from? Where did the Cook Islanders, where did the Maori come from,
Yeah.
So it was this massive question for me. And so once I started reading the writings and just I had this hunger and thirst for learning about the Baha'i faith.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. What do you think, Marjorie, what lessons do you think we can all learn from the Indigenous experience in Australia? I know there's been many different experiences, but what are some of the things we can all learn?
I've actually thought about this a lot, and it's just so many areas that need to be covered because I grew up with an inferior complex because of racism, and never being respected as a human being, and in that Aboriginal community and that close family environment, and knowing what love, what support we all had for each other and how we looked after each other, and that connectedness to each other and to the land in which we were living. So I think, if the language was retained, then it would be so much easier, because in there lies the stories of how things were created, how I can vaguely recall the Seven Sisters story, but I can't remember it enough to reiterate it. And how the magpie became black and white, all of these, stories that I can recall from when I was a child, but obviously I was too young at that stage. And then by the time I was a teenager, we're living at Burnwood Station, which is right next to Auburn Station. And my sister and I would walk for about 4 or 5 miles to jump in a car to go to school. And so that, there was this change in our environment. Previous to that, we'd lived on properties in a tent, whereby there was no education. So because my mother didn't read or write and my dad was working all day, so we didn't have lessons. And then we'd moved to Burnwood, and there was a school, Auburn River State School. And so my sister and I went along there and attended school. And so, it was this change of our upbringing. It changed everything about how we thought, what we did. You mentioned before about, in Indigenous studies in school. And, I can remember being taught by teachers who had absolutely no idea what they were teaching. And everything was about how great all of the discoverers, new founders of this country, and naming them, and Burke and Wills, how they died, but there was never a story about the Hornet Bank massacre. Today in Eidsvold, they actually speak Waka Waka language in the school.
Oh, wow.
So that...
Do you think that's a general trend? Is that, are we seeing changes in the education system here? Yes,
very, very slowly, but yes.
Right.
And, there's so much, so many differences between each of the tribes and their area and their experience, and, so many language groups, that it would be difficult for the education department to, have a blanket. And I would never like to see that. And I think that would be an insult to the Indigenous peoples of this country to do that. So, coming back to that core country and having those lessons presented by the people whom that language group is in that area. And predominantly in Eidsvold, it is the Waka Waka people and their language. So it's a great achievement.
But what about shared history? Because even though, so in Australia, from what I understand, there's over 250 Indigenous languages. And even though these are different, distinct groups of people, they've shared certain things in common. For example, oppression and massacres and, these types of things. What do you think that has done to the Indigenous people? Like, you shared a little bit personally about, growing up with inferiority complex, or just as a result of racism. What do you think this kind of shared experience has done as a whole?
So, when Australians go overseas for a holiday, let's say they go to Hawaii or Bali, South America, anywhere in Europe, New Zealand, there's a very good example. So they'll speak about New Zealand Māori with the greatest respect, and how wonderful their language, their songs, their dance, their protocols, their wharenuis, the whole deal.
Right.
But they know nothing about Australian Aboriginal First Nations peoples. And I find it very insulting that continues today still, as it did when I was a child. If people were to give some thought to how what they say and how they behave is impacting. If you go to Samoa, for instance, and you're walking through the village, you have to treat that village like it's somebody's home.
Right.
Those First Nations people of Samoa, the Samoan people. People do that from all countries. They will do that. And yet when we come to, say, Uluru, they show disrespect because there's this imbalance of understanding between a European culture or mindset to the Indigenous peoples.
Right.
The desecration of sacred sites is just become open slather pretty much. So that also, what is important to the people of the country, of that area, of that tribe, needs to be respected. And it's so unfortunate that there isn't a curriculum. But like I say, it's very challenging, because you would have to speak to the people of those areas, and we're getting further and further away from the understanding. It's like when religion is renewed,
right?
Our mindsets have to change to conform to that experience. So
we're losing it.
I think we are very, very quickly losing it. I'm always on my soapbox saying, no, I won't do that. I don't believe that. Or, that is going against what I know is my tribe's way of doing things and speaking to things. So more recently, a horoscope has been created using totems. And I was appalled, because it's now making a plaything of our totems, because Aboriginal people did not have horoscopes.
Right.
So, as we break down our belief systems and our traditions and our culture by bringing in those things which are foreign.
Right.
So foreign from our religious, spiritual beliefs.
So how do we change that? Like, how, for example, I recently just applied. I'm trying to become an Australian citizen, right? I'm an American. I'd get dual citizenship. I'd like to become an Australian citizen. And I took the citizenship test. And there's one of the questions I thought was interesting was, what are the 3 official flags of Australia? And it's the Australian one with the Union Jack and the stars. It's the Torres Strait Islander and the Aboriginal flag. What are some tangible things, for example, that we need to do to help educate the population of Australia and even the world?
Yes.
For example, you're saying people go on about Maori culture and everybody knows about it, but I think the only thing people know about Indigenous people of Australia is the didgeridoo and the boomerang.
Yeah.
So what needs to change?
Oh, I don't have that answer.
Things,
I wish I had that answer.
If you could tell, well, how about this, Marjorie? If you could tell me, what are 3 things or a couple of things Naysan, myself, can do to help, learn more about and understand more about the Indigenous culture of Australia in the area I live in?
I think the name places of where we are, like this is Jarowa country, and knowing, those traditional names for the country in which we are on, and the name and getting to, breaking down those barriers and showing the respect to the Indigenous people, instead of looking at them and, saying, all Aboriginal people are blah, 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 very negative, derogatory.
And that still happens? Like
Yes.
Have you experienced that?
I have. Yes.
Wow.
Unfortunately, but, I'm older now, so I'm a pretty naughty older person. And not all the time. I don't respond, because I just think it's not worth it. If somebody is a racist, then they're a racist, and nothing you say or do will ever change their mindsets. And I have grown up with several white people who still, they will speak to you, but they say, myself, okay, I'll use myself as an example. A friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, said, well, you're not a drunk and you're not a this, and you go to work and you've done blah, 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 and you've achieved all of these things, so everybody else can do that too. But as in all things, trauma and whether or not you're accepted in your community and how people treat you, whether they treat you with respect, is whether or not you're going to participate in that environment. So,
right.
You know, majority of Aboriginal people, they don't.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's so foreign. It's so foreign and they're abused so regularly.
Mm. But do you really think people can't be changed? If you're a racist, you're a racist? You don't think that through education, through celebrating Indigenous cultures, we can start to change?
I think we can start to. Yes, definitely. There has been a difference in the many years. Past several years, there has been an improvement whereby, Aboriginal people are accepted in restaurants and bars, and, I've been kicked out of a clothing boutique, so
really?
All of these types of things.
Yeah.
So they impact on your whole mindset about, how are you going to deal with this? And so I deal with it by just thinking, well, they're very ignorant. They have no idea. And all you can do is be an example of the better person.
Is there anything that you personally have, like, for example, the teachings of the faith or the prayers, or is there anything from the Baha'i faith that you've used in your own personal life that has helped you as far as strengthening your Indigenous identity?
Most everything, actually.
Really?
Yes, most everything. Because it gave me the power and the knowledge to identify and respect myself. Identify who I am and respect myself for being a good person, for being a human being, and just try your best to aspire to the teachings.
Is there anything you think we can do as Baha'is in Australia?
There's, it's being amongst in those communities, living in those communities, and being an example and being the wonderful, caring and loving Baha'is that I've experienced throughout my journey. And being one, so many different nationalities in one room. And, at any time I could, we'd always have a look around and say, oh, you're this you come from that country, you come from that country, and I come from that country, and there would always be sometimes 7 or 8 different nationalities of people coming from different parts of the world. And it's that we knew that was the case, but it was like talking and being with family.
Right.
There was no barriers to break down because we had that one common factor, that one belief in Baha'u'llah, and that brought us so close together as people. And I found that a very beautiful thing.
Thank you, Marjorie. I guess for me, I really hope that we're able to, have more of these conversations in general. I think what you're saying about just friendships and, I think in the writings we're told, deeds, not words. And I think it starts from just getting to know, Indigenous peoples in a sincere way, in those sincere friendships. And, hopefully that will help to, start to change the tide of prejudice. And
people need, just to be respectful. And, there's so much hurt within majority of Aboriginal people that I know, and especially of my age. And because of the trauma that we've lived through in that blatant racism that was in our face. I was in a classroom intermittently throughout my earlier years. And white kids sat on one side of the classroom and black kids sat on the other. You know, it was, you went to the movie theatre and the people who owned it would come and make sure, they would walk up and down like guards, making sure that the black kids and all the black people sat on the left-hand side and all the white people sat on the right-hand side of the theatre. Those kinds of blatant displays of racism in little towns. And I have been mistaken for many different nationalities myself. And I have never, ever been ashamed or even thought, you know, in a heartbeat to say I was a different nationality and, you know, where I come from. And I think if we know who we are, then, you know, we are just so much happier in being able to accept ourselves in this challenging racist environment. So this year's NAIDOC 2021, the topic is healing country. And in that regard, there was a family who had taken a star rock, stone, 130 kgs, from a property out in Taroom. And on Sunday, the first day of NAIDOC week, they're returning, walking that stone back on country. It will go through my traditional country, and I will join it around the 19th of July.
Wow.
And so that gives me an opportunity to be part of that and also to go back to where I grew up.
Fantastic.
So thank you for the opportunity to come on and share just my little story. There's so many stories, and until people start to approach Indigenous people and become friends with them and hear those stories, will they understand anything about the Indigenous peoples of this country, the first people, the First Nations people.
Well, I thank you. Thank you for being a part of this interview. And I really hope we're able to do more of these and hear more stories and talk to more Indigenous peoples. And thank you for sharing your story. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And I hope I'm able to meet you in person soon.
Thank you so much. I look forward to that.